At least the army pays her rent. The line landed like a slap across the marble floor. Laughter followed. Clean, polite, expensive laughter. The kind that sounded rehearsed, like applause from people who'd never been told no in their lives. Major General Grace Hayes froze just beyond the doorway of the ballroom, boots clicking softly against marble polished enough to see the chandeliers trembling in reflection. Her father's voice carried across the room, smooth, charming, practiced for boardrooms and television interviews. Richard Hayes, real estate magnate, philanthropist, father. He stood at the center of a circle of admirers, a glass of red wine raised like a scepter, his cufflinks flashing. He hadn't noticed her yet. He didn't notice much that couldn't make him richer. The general beside her, a man whose uniform carried quiet authority, silver hair, eyes cut from discipline, turned toward her. Major General Hayes, he said, voice low but formal. We're ready. She nodded once, steady. Understood, sir. Then she stepped forward. The crowd's laughter began to fade before anyone saw her. It was as if the air itself had stiffened. The sound of her medals, a subtle metallic whisper, and the glint of the twin stars on her shoulders seemed to silence the entire ballroom. Every eye turned toward her. She walked in measured steps, posture straight, gaze forward. Her father's glass hovered midair. His knuckles tightened around the stem until the red wine tipped and bled across his cuff like a spreading wound. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. The MC cleared his throat awkwardly. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Major General Grace Hayes of the United States Army, escorting General Robert McAllister. Applause rose hesitantly. The general walked past her father first, nodding curtly in greeting. Grace followed, stopping at the stage where the flag hung behind the podium. She turned to face it, hands snapping into salute with practiced precision. The sound of the crowd, rustling, whispers, nervous clearing of throats, filled the void her father's silence left behind. From the corner of her eye, she saw him staring. Richard Hayes, the man who'd once told her, "You'll come crawling home when your rent's due." The man who'd called her the disappointment with a duffel bag. Now he stood among his peers, the laughter that had mocked her rank still hanging in the air like smoke after a misfire. He didn't laugh now. The general took the podium. His voice carried calm command. Tonight, we gather to honor veterans' resilience, not just those who fought in battle, but those who carried that fight home. Service doesn't stop when the war does. Applause rolled through the room. Grace's gaze swept the audience. Polished jewelry, designer gowns, and behind them, a handful of veterans wearing their ribbons modestly on thrifted suits. Her father had built this event, sponsored the venue, bought the speeches. She wondered if he'd ever stepped into the VA ward 10 miles away. When the general said her name again, the crowd's attention swung back. Please welcome Major General Hayes, one of our youngest two-star officers, and proof that dedication, not privilege, earns respect. She approached the podium. The light caught the silver of her sword, the weight of her stars. Her father's lips parted, just slightly, but no sound came out. She began without notes. Service isn't about salary, she said. It's about showing up when no one else does. A ripple moved through the audience, some nodding, some uncomfortable. She continued, voice even. I come from a family that measures worth in numbers, income brackets, square footage, net gains. But service measures worth differently. It counts the ones who stand when standing costs something. The crowd hushed. Her gaze swept over them. Not accusing, not pleading, just steady. Her father's hand tightened around his wine glass again. I didn't join the army because it was easy. I joined because I wanted to build something no storm could buy or sell. Honor. Applause rose. Tentative at first, then strong. Her words hung in the air like a mirror no one wanted to look into. When she finished, the general shook her hand firmly. Well said, General. He turned to the audience. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what service sounds like. The applause this time was thunderous. People rose to their feet. Cameras flashed. In the corner, Richard Hayes clapped, slow, stiff, unsure of the script. Afterward, as the ballroom emptied into champagne chatter again, Grace lingered near the balcony overlooking the city her father built. The skyline shimmered in the night, glass towers like raised trophies. Beautiful, isn't it? The voice behind her was familiar. Older now, softer, stripped of arrogance. She turned. Her father stood there, wine replaced by water, his cuff still faintly stained. He looked smaller under the chandelier's glow, or maybe it was the absence of his entourage that made him human again. You look strong, he said. I am, she replied. A long silence. Then quietly, I'm proud of you. She didn't turn. Be proud of what I do, not what you think I am. He exhaled slowly, as though deflating. Maybe I never understood the difference. Then it's time you learn. He looked down at the city lights. You know, I built half of that skyline. I know, she said, but some things can't be built with concrete. Her tone wasn't cruel. It was calm, surgical. The kind of truth that doesn't seek revenge, only release. He nodded, eyes wet. You sound like your mother. Grace smiled faintly. She taught me how to survive you. They both laughed then, awkward, genuine, almost healing. The general reappeared at the doorway. General Hayes, the press would like a few photos. She nodded, turning back to her father. I have to go. He hesitated, then said softly, I'll try to show up next time. She met his eyes. That's all I ever wanted. As she walked away, the chandeliers flickered slightly, catching the reflection of her stars and her sword. Two symbols her father had never understood until now. The laughter that once mocked her pay had been replaced by silence, the kind of silence that demands respect. But the story didn't end in that ballroom. A week later, she invited him somewhere no chandelier could reach, a VA hospital cafeteria where humility wore name tags instead of medals. The VA hospital didn't smell like his kind of world. It smelled like coffee left too long on a burner, bleach, and the metallic tinge of wheelchairs being pushed over tile. Richard Hayes stepped inside hesitantly, his Italian loafers squeaking against the waxed floor. Around him, veterans moved like quiet shadows, some missing legs, others carrying scars you couldn't photograph. He clutched the visitor badge at his lapel. It read simply, R. Hayes, volunteer, new. Grace was already waiting in the cafeteria, her uniform immaculate, a paper cup steaming in her hand. You came, she said. He looked around. I said I would. His voice sounded smaller here, stripped of marble echo and audience approval. Grace gestured to the counter. Coffee's free if you pour it yourself. Don't worry. The CEO of Hayes Development Group can handle that, right? He smirked, then noticed the row of wheelchairs by the window. The smirk died. How often do you come here? Every week, she said. Every Tuesday at 0600. I bring coffee, cards, sometimes just silence. He hesitated, looking around again. You do this before work? She met his gaze. This is work. A nurse passed by and smiled. Morning, General. The guys are asking if you brought your dad. Grace grinned. I did. He's on coffee duty. The nurse laughed, waved at Richard. Good luck keeping up, sir. He raised a hand awkwardly. I'll do my best. When she left, he said under his breath, They call you General with that kind of warmth? Grace shrugged. Respect doesn't need to be cold to be real. They began serving coffee. It wasn't grand, just paper cups and creamer. But Richard moved slower than he ever had in any boardroom. Each hand he served belonged to someone whose world he'd never been able to buy. One man rolled up, his prosthetic legs clinking faintly beneath his chair. Thanks, Rich. The name startled him. You know who I am? Everyone does, the man said. You built the condos my son lives in, but this, he gestured to the coffee. This is the first thing you ever gave me personally. Grace watched her father's face shift, the gears of old arrogance grinding against something raw. He poured another cup, steadier this time. Hours passed in the slow rhythm of small conversations. Veterans joked about scars, about nurses, about how the TV never worked but the coffee never stopped flowing. Grace moved among them effortlessly, one hand resting on shoulders, another helping stack trays, her laughter cutting clean through the hum of respirators. Richard just watched for a while. The daughter he'd mocked for wasting potential now commanded a room not through money, but presence. Finally, as they sat on the edge of a table eating sandwiches, he said quietly, You're different here. So are you, she replied. He studied her. You really never cared about what I thought, did you? She smiled. You're wrong. I cared too much. That's what hurt. The honesty caught him off guard. And now? Now I care differently, she said. I stopped needing you to believe in me. I just needed to keep believing in the uniform. A veteran rolled past, giving Grace a fist bump. See you next week, ma'am. She returned it. Don't skip therapy again, Jack. He winked. Can't promise anything. When he was gone, Richard exhaled. They love you. They trust me, she corrected. There's a difference. Love forgives failure. Trust remembers effort. That night, back at his penthouse, he couldn't sleep. The silence felt too clean, too empty. His reflection in the floor-to-ceiling glass stared back, tired, hollow, unsatisfied. He wandered to his desk and opened a drawer. Inside lay an envelope from years ago, the one he'd left on the kitchen counter the day she enlisted. Final contribution. He had forgotten what was inside? A blank check. It had been meant as insult. Now it looked like a confession. He sat down and began to write on the back. I thought success was measured in square footage. I was wrong. It's measured in the space between what you give and what you keep. He folded the note and placed it in his wallet. Over the next few weeks, Richard kept returning to the VA. Not with Grace, not for photos, but alone. He served coffee, folded blankets, even learned to play chess badly with a one-eyed Marine who cheated openly and laughed every time he caught him. He didn't correct anyone who called him rich. He liked how it sounded when it wasn't said with envy. The first time the local paper noticed, they called Grace for comment. She said only, "He's learning the language of service. It takes time to pronounce." A month later, he stood beside her again, this time at the ribbon cutting of a new rehabilitation wing he had quietly funded. The reporters asked him, "Why the sudden change of heart, Mr. Hayes?" He smiled, eyes flicking toward his daughter. "I used to build towers, he said. Now I help people stand." The flashbulbs went wild. But the photo that ran the next morning wasn't the handshake or the ribbon. It was a candid shot. Richard pouring coffee beside his daughter, both laughing. The caption read, "From skyscrapers to service." That evening, Grace found him in the hospital courtyard. He sat on a bench beneath the flag, the sunset casting long gold streaks across the stone. "You handled that press circus better than I expected," she said. He chuckled. "You think I did it for the headlines?" "You used to." He looked up at the flag, fluttering quietly. "I used to think respect came from being seen. Turns out it comes from standing in the background." She nodded, understanding the language he was finally learning. Before they left, a nurse approached with a camera. "One photo for the bulletin board?" They agreed. She snapped it. Father and daughter side by side, coffee cups in hand, flag above them. Later, when the photo was printed, someone pinned it just beneath the headline, "Real heroes don't need titles." Grace smiled when she saw it. Her father did too. And for once, he didn't reach to adjust the lighting. Months later, an envelope would arrive at her office. Her father's handwriting shaky but sure. Inside was a torn photo from years ago, taped together with a note that would end the longest war she'd ever fought, the one inside her own family. The envelope came on a Tuesday morning. No return address, just her name written in deliberate, uneven strokes that still managed to look proud. Madge Jenner Grace Hayes, Fort Belvoir Headquarters. She recognized the handwriting immediately, her father's. It had the same weight as his voice, too confident for its own good, softened only by age and regret. For a moment, she just stared at it, thumb tracing the edge. Then she opened it carefully, the paper crackling like memory. Inside was a folded photograph, yellowed and torn clean down the middle, taped back together along the seam. It was her, 18, standing in her first Army uniform, all nerves and defiance. Her father's hand was on her shoulder, or half of it was since the photo had been ripped once before and repaired now. Behind it was a note written in the same bold hand. "You were right. Honor isn't inherited, it's chosen. I measured everything in the wrong currency. Proud to be your father." Finally. R. Grace sat back in her chair. Her office, normally sharp, efficient, a command post of paperwork and control, felt suddenly too quiet. The paper shook slightly in her hand. She set it down before her pulse betrayed her. That weekend, she drove to the Fairfax estate for the first time in years. The gates were open. The place looked smaller now, or maybe she had simply grown into her own scale. Her mother greeted her at the door, still graceful, still a diplomat in every gesture. "He's upstairs," Aunt Helen said. "Heart's weaker now, but his pride's doing better." Grace smiled faintly. "You always could make a battle sound like a blessing." Helen touched her cheek. "You two are more alike than you think. That's what made it so hard." She found him in the study. His command post, surrounded by framed headlines, models of skyscrapers, and the same leather chair he'd once refused to let her sit in. Now he was thinner, his hair completely white, a blanket draped across his legs. He looked up from the fireplace. "Well," he said, voice low, "if it isn't the woman who outranks the family." She leaned against the doorway. "You sent me something." "I did," he said. "Did you read it?" "I did." "And?" She crossed to him, the floor creaking softly beneath her boots. "And I believe you." He blinked, taken aback. "You do?" She nodded. "You wouldn't have sent it if you didn't mean it." He laughed quietly. "You know, I used to hate that calm of yours, that silence. Always thought it meant defiance. Took me too long to realize it was strength." Grace sat across from him. The firelight caught the silver on her shoulders, and for the first time in her life, he didn't look away from them. He poured them both tea from a set that hadn't been touched in years. His hands trembled slightly, but he didn't hide it. "I've been going through old things, huh?" he said. "Found that photo, the one I tore up when you enlisted. I remember. I taped it back together. I noticed." He looked down. "You were just a kid, and I thought I was protecting you from failure. Truth is, I was protecting myself from irrelevance." Grace said nothing. Sometimes the best thing to say to truth is silence. He continued, slower now. "You were the one person in my life I couldn't buy, and I didn't know how to love something I couldn't control." Grace reached forward, took his cup gently before it spilled. "You don't have to explain." "Yes, I do," he said, voice breaking. "You earned everything I spent a lifetime pretending I had." The air in the room shifted. No theatrics, no tears, just the sound of 2 decades of tension exhaling. After a long moment, he asked, "Do you still go to that hospital?" "Every week." "I think I'd like to go again." "You already did more than enough." He smiled faintly. "That's what you said when you were 12 and carried that lost dog home. You said, 'He's already done enough wandering.' Guess I'm the dog now." Grace laughed softly. "You're not wrong." He looked at her, eyes clearer than they'd been in years. "Do you remember what you told me at the gala? Be proud of what I do, not what you think I am." He nodded. "Well, I'm proud of both now. Took me 40 years to earn that sentence." For the first time, she reached out, hand on his. His skin was cold but steady. "I'm glad you did," she said. He squeezed her fingers. "Me too." When she left that night, the air outside smelled of rain and cedar, the same as the morning she'd shipped out for basic. She paused at the gate, looking back at the house. For years, it had been the symbol of everything she'd fought against: wealth, control, expectation. Now it just looked like what it was: home. Imperfect, aging, but still standing. 2 weeks later, she got the call. Cardiac arrest, peaceful. She drove back to Fairfax in full uniform this time. The press gathered outside the gates again, headlines already drafted. "Real estate titan dies, daughter, Army general, to deliver eulogy." Helen met her at the door, eyes swollen but peaceful. "He left something else for you," she said, handing over a sealed envelope. Inside was a smaller note written in shaky ink. "If pride built walls, your service built bridges. You turned our name into something I can finally salute. Don't wear my regret, wear your stars. Dad." Grace folded the letter and slipped it into her uniform pocket. It fit there like it had been waiting for years. The funeral was held 3 days later. A small service, family, and a few veterans from the hospital in attendance. As the flag was folded, Grace stood tall at the front, eyes clear. When they handed her the triangle of cloth, she didn't cry. She simply whispered, "At ease, Dad." And for once, she meant it. Once, After the funeral, she returned to the same ballroom where her humiliation had begun, this time to speak at a memorial fundraiser in his name. The crowd that once mocked her pay would rise for her again, not in shock, but in gratitude. The chandeliers were the same, heavy, glittering, obscene in their opulence. The ballroom smelled of money and old pride. But this time, Major General Grace Hayes wasn't there as an escort. She was the keynote speaker. Her father's foundation, now renamed the Hayes Veterans Initiative, had rebuilt the annual gala he'd once used for status into a fundraiser for housing and mental health programs. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all her. She stood backstage as the MC finished his introduction. His words echoed across the room, smooth and rehearsed. Tonight, we honor the legacy of Richard Hayes, a man who learned, late but fully, that the truest investments are in people. And we welcome his daughter, Major General Grace Hayes, whose service redefined what that legacy means. Applause rose. She stepped into the light. The audience stood as she approached the podium. Her dress uniform shimmered under the chandeliers, 2 stars catching every reflection. In the front row, her mother sat next to General McAllister, who gave a small, respectful nod. Grace waited for the applause to die, then she began. "My father used to measure life in square footage," she said. "He believed if something didn't rise above the skyline, it wasn't worth seeing." A soft ripple of laughter moved through the room, uneasy, but honest. But toward the end of his life, he learned something the hard way. Not everything worth building can be seen from the street. Silence settled, the kind that invites listening. She glanced at the table where his friends once toasted his arrogance. Now those same men sat quietly, heads bowed in discomfort and respect. She continued, voice steady, unhurried. "When I joined the Army, my father told me I was throwing my life away. He thought service was a tax write-off. But what he never understood then, and finally did before he left, was that service doesn't reduce you. It refines you." Her tone softened, threading Grace into precision. "I've seen soldiers with nothing give more than billionaires who have everything. And I've seen men with medals as heavy as guilt and others with none who carry nations on their backs." She paused, letting the words land where they needed to. In the end, the difference between wealth and worth isn't the number of zeros in your bank account. It's the number of hands you lift when no one's watching. The audience stirred. Her mother wiped a tear discreetly. McAllister folded his arms, proud. Grace took a breath, steady but full. "This foundation was my father's apology, but it's also his proof that even pride can learn humility, and even silence can be redeemed by action. He built towers, I build bridges. And tonight, I'm asking you to help build the next one." She gestured toward the screen behind her. Photos flickered. Veterans at the hospital, new housing projects, kids in uniform handing out coffee beside her father. Her voice quieted. "He learned that honor isn't a rank, it's a decision." Applause began, slow at first, then swelling. But she raised a hand gently, stopping it. "Don't clap for me," or she said. "Clap for the ones who stand when standing costs them everything." The audience rose to its feet. This time, the standing wasn't shock or guilt. It was reverence. As the applause thundered, Grace turned her head slightly toward the ceiling, where chandeliers glowed like constellations. Somewhere above them, she imagined her father watching, glass in hand, maybe still trying to correct her posture, but smiling anyway. For the first time, she smiled back. After the ceremony, the crowd thinned. Donors shook her hand, veterans saluted, journalists asked for quotes. She answered each with calm precision, the way she'd learned to manage both battlefield and ballroom. When it was finally quiet, she walked alone toward the back of the room. That was where he'd stood the night he'd mocked her. "At least the Army pays her rent." Now the words felt like a relic from another era. On the table nearby, she noticed something, a framed plaque she hadn't seen before. The Richard and Grace Hayes Rehabilitation Center. In honor of all who learn, late or early, that service builds more than walls. She ran her fingers lightly across the inscription. The engraved gold letters gleamed under the light like an old wound that had finally scarred over clean. "Ma'am?" She turned. It was one of the young volunteers, barely 20, crisp in his first dress uniform. "Yes, Private?" He hesitated. "Permission to ask something personal?" "Go ahead." My dad, he laughs at my pay, says I'm wasting time. But watching you tonight, he swallowed, made me think maybe I'm not. Grace smiled softly. You're not wasting time. You're giving it meaning. He nodded, blinking fast, then saluted. She returned it. Sharp. Perfect. As he turned away, she murmured just loud enough for herself. You mocked my service, Dad. Now the uniform you belittled carries our name. Later, in the courtyard outside, she found McAllister waiting. He stood beside a fountain, hands in pockets, that same granite steadiness about him. You did him justice, he said. He finally did himself justice, she replied. He smiled. You ever wonder how he'd react if he could see all this? She looked at the night sky, where the city lights faded into stars. He'd probably say he designed the chandelier better. They both laughed quietly. The laughter faded into the soft hum of crickets. Then McAllister spoke again. You know, there's a saying in the old ranks, he said. Wealth builds empires. Service builds legacies. Grace nodded. He built one. I just made sure it stood for something. She looked up at the flag above the courtyard, its reflection rippling on the marble floor like liquid light. Forgiveness ends, wars, pride can't, she whispered. Right after the audience rose to its feet, insert. Some wars aren't fought with weapons. They're fought with mirrors, until one day, you stop trying to win and start trying to understand. Camera pans upward, from her reflection in the polished floor to the chandelier above, symbolizing reversal. The once condescending height of wealth now mirroring the grounded clarity of service. Months later, her father's foundation would receive the Congressional Medal for Civil Service, awarded posthumously. And when Grace accepted it, she'd wear no stars, no sword, no medals, only the photo he'd taped back together. Winter settled over D.C. like a flag folded tight, cold, clean, ceremonial. Snow dusted the Capitol steps where the crowd gathered, their breath rising in soft white clouds. Inside, beneath the rotunda, the air carried that hushed kind of reverence that comes when even power has to bow. The Hayes Veterans Initiative was being awarded the Congressional Medal for Civil Service. Richard Hayes's name was etched on the plaque, but it was Grace's hand that would receive it. She wasn't wearing the general's full dress uniform. She'd chosen her father's old charcoal suit, perfectly tailored, the one he'd worn to his last gala. On her collar, though, she'd pinned a small army lapel, her quiet reminder of where this story began. The hall was filled with officers, senators, veterans, and quiet civilians who'd benefited from the foundation's work. Wheelchairs lined up in front, gold lapel pins shining like small suns. The Speaker of the House cleared his throat. We honor the legacy of a man who learned that greatness is not measured by ownership but by service. Then turning toward her, and the daughter who carried that lesson further than he ever dreamed. The applause rolled like distant thunder. Grace stepped forward, heels clicking against marble, the photo in her hand already creased from being held too tightly. When the medal was placed in her palm, she didn't look at the cameras. She looked at the audience, the veterans, the nurses, the janitor in uniform blues at the back who still stood at attention. On behalf of the Hayes family, she began, "Thank you." She paused, steady. My father spent his life building skylines. I spent mine learning how to stand under them. This medal doesn't belong to us. It belongs to everyone who taught us that wealth means nothing if it can't lift someone else. The applause came again, stronger. Her voice didn't waver. But this moment, she said, belongs to one man who made the hardest admission of all that he'd been wrong. And after the ceremony, she slipped away from the reporters and noise. The marble corridors echoed with footsteps and old history. She found herself in the memorial wing, the one lined with portraits of Medal of Honor recipients. The walls smelled faintly of wax and paper. The silence felt alive. She stopped before one plaque. Major General Robert McAllister, recently retired. Below his inscription, courage in leadership, dignity in silence. A faint smile curved her lips. She didn't notice the figure behind her until he spoke. I wondered if I'd find you hiding in the Hall of Ghosts. She turned. McAllister himself, coat draped over his arm, grin half weary, half proud. Congratulations, General, he said. You made Congress cry. That's harder than most battles. She laughed softly. It wasn't about me. It never is, he said. That's why it works. They walked together out onto the steps, snow crunching beneath their boots. The city stretched below, monuments, marble, the frozen Potomac catching the last orange light of day. You ever think he'd end like this? McAllister asked quietly. Grace looked toward the skyline. His skyline. He didn't end, she said. He finished. McAllister nodded, approving the difference. They stood in silence a while, the kind that fills rather than empties. Finally, she turned to him. You know what I realized? What's that? My father and I fought two different wars. His was against failure. Mine was against his reflection of me. And who won? She smiled faintly. Neither. We both surrendered. That night, she drove to Arlington. The cemetery glowed pale under the snow. She parked by Section 67, the newer plots, and walked until she found it. Richard Hayes, 1954-2024. He built walls, she built bridges. Beside it, as she'd arranged, lay a small bronze duplicate of the Civil Service medal, sealed into the stone. Grace knelt, brushing a dusting of snow from the letters. She laid the folded photograph beside the base. The tape had begun to yellow, but the seam still held. You did it, she said softly. And this time, I didn't have to stand alone. The wind answered with a slow rustle through the flags nearby, that low, steady whisper of permanence. She stayed a long time, watching the snow thicken, her breath mingling with the mist. Then quietly she saluted. Not sharp, but slow, deliberate. A soldier's gesture softened by a daughter's forgiveness. When she lowered her hand, the snow had already begun to cover the photo. She let it. A month later, a photograph appeared in Stars and Stripes. Grace standing in the snow, hand to brow, head bowed before her father's grave. The caption read, "Service comes home." At headquarters, weeks later, her aide found her in the office unpacking a small wooden box. The Civil Service medal inside, along with the note he'd written, "Honor isn't inherited, it's chosen." Ma'am, the aide asked, where should I file it? Grace looked at the medal a long time. Then she smiled. Nowhere. Some honors aren't for display. She placed it in the bottom drawer under her father's old photo, the torn, mended one, and closed it gently. That night, she walked through the base courtyard. Snow was falling again, soft and silent. The flag hung low, heavy with winter air. She stopped beneath it, hands clasped behind her back, the stars of her rank catching the faint light. Forgiveness ends, war's pride can't, she whispered. Her breath curled upward, joining the snow, dissolving into the same still air that had carried her father's voice once, long ago. For the first time, there was no bitterness, no echo, no unfinished sentence. Only peace. Spring came early that year. The first warm wind swept across Arlington, carrying the faint scent of lilacs and old paper. For once, the flags didn't just stand still. They waved as if saluting something invisible, something mended. Major General Grace Hayes stood at the front of the Honor Guard platform, her uniform pressed, her expression softer than it used to be. The lines that war and time had etched into her face were still there, but now they looked less like scars and more like script, a story written in endurance. The ceremony that morning wasn't about her father, or her medals, or even her legacy. It was about the new recruits, 40 men and women standing in perfect formation under a sky so blue it looked rehearsed. The youngest was 20, the oldest 38. None of them had been alive when her first deployment began. They saluted her like she was history. Grace stepped to the podium, sunlight catching the silver in her hair. She didn't need notes. She never had. When I was your age, she began, I thought rank meant certainty, that the higher you climbed, the less you questioned. The crowd stood silent, the kind of silence that invites the truth to walk in. I was wrong, she continued. Rank doesn't bring certainty. It brings responsibility. To speak when silence costs someone else too much. A murmur of agreement moved through the front row. She saw it in their faces, that restless idealism that only the newly commissioned carry. My father used to tell me that the world runs on power, she said. He was half right. Power moves things, but only service keeps them standing. She glanced toward the American flag behind her. If you're looking for pride, you'll find it in applause. If you're looking for purpose, you'll find it in work that no one applauds at all. The recruits straightened a little taller. Somewhere behind them, the wind carried the faint flutter of their dress flags, like whispers agreeing. Grace smiled faintly. You'll have moments that break you. People will underestimate you, mock you, even betray you. Some will tell you that service isn't worth the cost. But every time you stand up again, you remind the world what honor actually looks like. She paused, scanning the crowd. And one day, maybe 20 years from now, someone will look at you the way I'm looking at you now, and they'll see not a soldier, but a mirror. A reminder that what we serve doesn't die when we're gone. When she finished, she didn't invite applause. Instead, she raised her hand in salute. The entire formation returned it. 40 salutes rising as one, blades of resolve cutting into the morning sun. And in that silence, her father's voice seemed to drift back from memory, amused, awed, maybe a little proud. You really did it, kid. Her lips curved just slightly. Yeah, Dad, we did. After the ceremony, the crowd filtered out. She lingered alone by the flagpole, watching the recruits file past in perfect step. Their boots struck the ground with the same rhythm her own once had, back when she thought belonging was something she had to earn. Now she knew better. Belonging was something you built. McAllister approached from behind, retired now, walking slower but still radiating that unshakable command. You've got their attention, he said. All 40 of them look at you like you invented gravity. Grace chuckled. Then I better make sure they don't float off when I'm gone. He smirked. What's next for you? Teaching, she said. Strategy, ethics, maybe a little humility, if they can handle it. He nodded approvingly. That's the hardest lesson of all. They walked together toward the memorial wall, names carved deep into the stone, the kind of permanence that only sacrifice buys. You ever think you'd end up here? He asked quietly. She smiled. Not in marble, I hope. But yes, I think this was always the destination. Every battle, every bruise, every silence was just a turn on the road home. They stopped before one name, her father's, carved beside a bronze plaque honoring the Foundation's national service. He read the inscription aloud. Forgiveness ends wars, pride can't. Then he looked at her. That yours? She nodded. His words, my rewrite. Later, she visited the VA hospital again. The same one where it had all begun. The smell of coffee and disinfectant hit her like an old song. The bulletin board by the entrance still had their picture. Her and her father, sleeves rolled up, handing coffee to a smiling veteran. Someone had added a caption in marker below it. The richest cup in America. She laughed softly. He would have liked that. Then she spent the next hour exactly how he would have hated. Serving coffee, folding blankets, talking more than listening. That evening, when she returned home, the light over her porch flickered once before turning steady. Her mother had left a small box on the steps. Inside was the original torn photograph, repaired again, this time laminated to last. On the back was a note in her mother's careful handwriting. He wanted this to live where people could see it. He said, "Tell her I finally learned what those stars mean." Grace smiled through the ache. She framed it and hung it above her desk. Not in her office, but in her living room, where visitors would ask, "Who's that with you?" And she'd say simply, "The man who taught me the price of pride and the value of peace." That night, she sat on her porch under the stars. The same sky her father once thought he could own now shimmered freely above her. She whispered, not as a soldier, not as a daughter, just as herself. Forgiveness isn't surrender. It's strategy. The only one that ever wins. A soft wind answered. Not quite words, but close enough to feel like one last salute. My father mocked my army pay. Until 2 stars in a hospital changed his legacy. He laughed when I said Veteran Foundation. Until my medal paid every debt Dad thought I'd never make rent. But General's salute made my coin worth millions. They called me poor for serving. Then my mother's flag became the real inheritance family. Laughed at my military life until the ceremony rebuilt more than a fortune,